Let's begin. We are all tech critics now. Indeed, there is a growing consensus that the internet that we have is not the internet that we want or that we need. That the commercial web has succeeded for the investor class, but that it has largely failed democracy. One of our aims at the Mike Center in organizing the symposium was to provide a forum for those who possess not only a rearguard critique of our existing communications order, but also an affirmative vision for a truly democratic internet. For folks who believe that we can do more than tinker and tweak the business models of social media monopolies and telecom leviathans. That we can, in fact, create something new, something better, that another internet is possible. We've heard similar refrains today. And one of the most prolific thinkers within this burgeoning, let's call it a nascent movement, to democratize the internet, to exert greater public control over our collective digital future, is Ben Tarnoff. Ben is a tech worker, writer, and co-founder of Logic magazine. His writing has appeared in outlets such as The New York Times, The Guardian, Jacobin, and The New Republic, just to name a few. He is the author of the acclaimed book, Internet for the People, The Fight for Our Digital Future, which was published last year by Verso. And he is also the co-editor with Maura Weigel of Voices from the Valley. Tech workers talk about what they do and how they do it, which was published in 2020. Ben's keynote talk today, not quite tonight, is entitled The Technologies of All Dead Generations. He will address how we can take our technological inheritance, one that has been engineered for war-making, empire, racial domination, and capital accumulation, in his words, and fashion it into something that sustains solidarity and self-determination. So, with that, it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome our keynote speaker, Ben Tarnoff.
Hey everybody, can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? All right, thank you so much, David, for that introduction. To David, Victor, Breyer, Edwin, the staff of the Annenberg Center for making this possible. This has been a really cool day. I feel like I've been taking so many notes, my hand is like cramping up actually. So I want to do this maybe every year, if that's okay with you. It's like summer camp. I never went to summer camp, but it's how I imagine it would be at its best. So I apologize in advance if anything that follows has a disjointed quality. These ideas are certainly, let's say, in development, an alpha, perhaps a beta. They will benefit from further development and dialogue with all of you. So I hope to leave ample time for discussion at the end. And I'd like to talk to you today about the possibilities for creating a better technological future, which I think has been a theme of today's discussions. But before I do, I'm going to tell you about a near-death experience I had on an airplane, just to open on a more personal note. Some of you may be familiar with the Azores. They're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And in the middle of the Azores is a place called Lajes Airport. The island it sits on was made from the merger of 4 volcanoes. And the Portuguese settled this island actually in the 15th century, and it has a kind of storied Cold War history because in the 20th century it became a very popular pit stop for US military aircraft transiting the Atlantic. So why are we talking about Lajes Airport? So late last year I landed there on a malfunctioning Airbus. We were flying from Lisbon to Boston. At some point the pilot very belatedly realized that the fuel tanks were broken. We were hemorrhaging fuel. We didn't have enough to make it to Boston. We would have crash landed in the ocean. So he decides we need to make a rapid descent in the nearest airport, which is Lajes Airport. It was a kind of exciting moment. There's a lot of tension in the cabin. And as this is all happening and we're kind of looking out, thinking about the different ways we could die, I overhear a woman sitting directly behind me, the row behind me, saying that if we crashed in the Atlantic, among the things that would be lost, in addition, of course, to 200 lives, which matter, would be her Bitcoin holdings. And that's because Those holdings were on what's known as a hard wallet, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is essentially a digital storage device that holds the cryptographic keys that confer ownership of a particular quantity of digital currency. And this remark that I think was made jokingly in an attempt to diffuse the considerable tension that you might imagine is accumulating in the cabin in the minds of the passengers actually initiates a conversation between her and the older man sitting next to her, a conversation that continues long after we safely, thank God, land at Lodges Airport and the technicians come out to fix the plane. The older man sitting next to her wanted to know how Bitcoin worked. And she, is that funny? She explained, and a conversation came to a halt, and a moment passed, a kind of long, pregnant silence, right? And then he replied that he was reading a book about how every civilization in history that went to shit did so because its money, its currency, had been devalued. And the case in point, he said, was Nero, that Nero had reduced the precious metal content of Roman coins in order to fund increased government spending, which in turn facilitated all sorts of very bad behavior, which fatally weakened the Roman Empire. And the lesson, as you might expect, is that monetary debasement always prefigures and produces a moral debasement that eventually leads to total social collapse. So when I heard that, I thought that was kind of a non sequitur. It's the kind of thing that men say when they're not really paying attention. But I was totally wrong. Like, the woman vigorously agreed. And the conversation, which up until that point had advanced a bit awkwardly by fits and starts, found a deeper channel. Like, they were friends now. There was a connection being made. She responded that no Nero could abase Bitcoin because the total number of coins was capped at 21 million, thus rendering inflation impossible. Not actually, I wanted to interject. And its trustless architecture made the meddling evils of central banking impossible, right? Again, not actually. But nonetheless, soon we're back in the air, fuel tanks fixed, and the conversation went on and on. Now, I knew nothing about this woman, but it was evident that her experience with Bitcoin had helped imbue her with a particular politics, a politics that is sometimes somewhat bloodlessly known as libertarianism, but which could be more descriptively defined as a melange of paranoia and misanthropy, seasoned with various exotic and often incorrect ideas about how the economy works. And this politics, as the scholar David Galumbi has argued, is embedded into Bitcoin as a technology, as the basic conceptual substrate upon which the software is built. I think it would be reasonable to regard this phenomenon with alarm. At a time of rising far-right movements around the world, Bitcoin offers yet another boost to the forces of reaction. But that's not actually what I remember feeling on the plane. What I remember feeling was envy. If there are technologies that can propagate selfishness, why can't we have technologies that propagate solidarity? The law professor Frank Pascal has a piece from the LP blog in 2019 where he posits that there have been two waves of activism and research around algorithmic accountability. The first wave, Frank says, was about improving existing systems, while the second wave was about asking whether certain systems should be used at all, and if so, who gets to govern them. So one of his examples, a classic example, is facial recognition software. So a first waver might look at a facial recognition system and want to identify the biases, whereas a second waver might ask, should such software work? Should it exist at all? Should we try to be improving it, or should we, in fact, abolish them? So as distinct as these two waves are, they do share something in common, which is they both arrive after the fact to critique an existing technology. But there is a further step that needs to be taken, which is a step that has really been a theme of many of the discussions today. At some point, we need to move from critique to creation. I think Ethan actually used this phrasing. And this move just might serve as the basis for a third wave of algorithmic accountability. which would concern itself not with ameliorating or abolishing existing systems, although that work is important, but with building new ones. I particularly like thinking about third waves because third wave ska and third wave coffee have been very important to my personal development. This is the only joke slide. I'm really sorry I had to get this in there. We're going to move on as quickly as possible. All right, more seriously. So importantly, the different waves don't displace one another, but like real waves, they interpenetrate. Harm reduction is an important complement to abolition, and both in turn can help clear the space in which alternatives may emerge. And I think we've already seen evidence of this in recent years, where the first two waves of algorithmic accountability have helped stimulate greater interest in different forms of technological practice, particularly when it comes to the internet. I don't have to tell this crowd that there are now a number of ongoing experiments with things like collectively governed social media sites, worker-owned app-based services, as well as increased enthusiasm in recent years for well-established alternative ownership models like publicly and cooperatively owned broadband networks. So the third wave of algorithmic accountability, if you accept that framing, is already here. It's already in motion, and it's a welcome development. I think all of us have different points of emphasis, perhaps come from somewhat different political traditions, but I think I would posit, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, share a basic enthusiasm for these alternatives that are proliferating. So it's a development I wholeheartedly support, but I'm also wary of it, and I think that my wariness is going to be the point of departure for what I'm talking about today. There is a sense of relief when one moves from critique to creation. It satisfies this familiar American impulse to be constructive, practical, solution-oriented. And this introduces a danger, I think, which is that in the comfort we derive from finally doing something, instead of just talking and writing and analyzing and arguing, we get too comfortable. And we act without an adequate understanding of the difficulties that condition and constrain our activity. For our efforts to have any chance of success, I think we need that understanding. And to develop that understanding, I think we need critique, unfortunately. I think we can't move beyond it. Critique is how we make the map of the terrain that the creativity of the third wave must traverse. And this terrain is necessarily contradictory. It compels us to think in contradictions and to be patient in doing so. So for inspiration, we turn, as often we do, to Grace Lee Boggs, who tells us progress does not take place like a shot out of a pistol. It requires the labor, patience, and suffering of the negative. Boggs was a Hegelian for whom the working through of the contradictions or limitations inherent in any idea is the dialectical process whereby we arrive at better, more developed ideas. But here she is counseling us not to rush the negative moment of the dialectic, to sit with the contradictions instead of hurrying to resolve them. So in that spirit, let's embrace the negativity. Let's suffer together serenely as we return to the question that I asked on the airplane, which is, if there are technologies that propagate selfishness, why can't we make technologies that propagate solidarity? And that, in fact, is the animating question of the third wave of algorithmic accountability. Another way of asking it is, how do we do politics through technology? So first, a definition. What is politics? Let's say that politics is the set of practices through which a group of human beings arrive at a particular distribution of social power. And let's say further that capitalism is inherently depoliticizing. Capitalism introduces what appears to be a natural separation between the economic and the political, with the economic understood as a space of impersonal, automatic market forces. And this is why capitalist societies, in the words of the philosopher Tony Smith, systematically generate an impoverished idea of the political. So officially, politics is confined to the state, or really just a segment of the state. But one way to see the history of social movements under capitalism is as a series of struggles against this impoverishment of the political. The labor and socialist movements politicized the economy. The feminist, queer liberation, and black liberation movements politicized many other zones of social life, from the family to the school, from the household to the lunch counter. And we could place the three waves of algorithmic accountability within this lineage. They all represent attempts to politicize technology. But I think there's an important distinction that we should make between the first two waves and the third wave, which is that the first two waves make technology an object of politics, but they generally target regulatory or legislative solutions, which is to say their interventions generally remain within the realm of official politics. For example, a first waver might demand that regulatory agencies submit automated systems to algorithmic audits or impact assessments in order to identify biases, while a second waiver might demand a legislative ban on certain types or uses of software, like facial recognition. There have been a number of municipalities that have passed such bans. The third wave, by contrast, not only makes technology an object of politics, but a terrain of politics. It wants to do politics through technology. And this means that the third waiver must develop an analysis of the specificities of technology as a site of political struggle, in the same way that feminists had to develop an analysis of the specificities of the household as a site of political struggle. To do politics through technology, we need to understand how technologies do politics. Now, I'm sure people in this room are familiar with Langdon Winter's work and his famous line that artifacts have politics. And Winter's argument is that the political qualities of a technical object, which again, returning to our definition of politics, how it alters the distribution of social power, are at least in part internal to the object itself. So one of Winter's examples is drawn from Robert A. Caro's famous biography of Robert Moses. Many of you know what this picture is of. So according to Caro, and this is actually an account that has been somewhat complicated, contested in later years, but I think is still a very useful illustration of Winter's argument. According to Caro, Moses designed the overpasses on his Long Island parkways to be too low for buses to pass under. In particular, he did so, Caro says, in order to prevent poor people, and particularly poor Black and Puerto Rican people, Moses being a notorious racist, from getting to Jones Beach. So for Winter, this is a useful illustration of his argument, because even a fairly unsophisticated artifact like an overpass can embody and enact a political project. Now, we could arrive at the same insight through Marx. Sometimes Marxists make too much of the distinction between the forces of production, the tools and techniques that are used to make the means of life, and the relations of production, the set of human relationships through which those means of life are made. But as Marx's work makes clear, this is a false distinction. Productive forces always materialize within a particular matrix of social relations and act upon those social relations in turn. Take what is most possibly the most consequential technology in human history, the steam engine. Its modern iteration appeared in the late 18th century and conquered the British cotton industry by the middle of the 19th. And in doing so, it displaced a competing technology, which is the water wheel. Picture of a water wheel for you. As Andreas Malm's work has shown, the steam engine was not necessarily more advanced in any objective sense than the water wheel. It did not produce more power at lower cost. It did produce portable power, however, and this was the secret to the technology's success. So if you think about how a water wheel works, river power can only be harnessed in particular places. You have to be close to the river and an appropriate river for a mill. And this presents a problem for the owners of cotton mills in Britain. The countryside was where the streams were, but it was sparsely populated. So you actually had to bring workers from the more populated areas and house them in what they called colonies near the mills. And these workers were, in addition to being scarce and imposing all these costs of bringing them in, were often unreliable and insubordinate, which stalled production and suppressed profits. The steam engine, by contrast, didn't care about geography. So a steam-powered mill could be built anywhere. So industrial capitalists of the time began building them in cities where, unlike the countryside, there are plenty of workers, many of whom are already used to the long hours, the monotonous work, and the discipline of the new industrial system. So they could be hired and fire it as needed without needing to be housed and trained. The greater mobility of steam enables the British cotton industry to develop a cheaper and more obedient workforce. It helps create a different kind of relationship between two groups of people, the owners of the mills and those who worked in them. And this story, I think, illustrates a very important aspect of technologies having politics, which is the politics of a technology are deeply involved in determining the viability of that technology. Steam power stuck, not because it was more efficient in any neutral sense, but because its political qualities helped advance the interests of a rising industrial capitalist class who could use it to strengthen control over labor and to increase profits. And one could tell similar stories about any number of other technologies. There are always different ways to stage or to solve a technical problem, even defining what counts as a technical problem. There are always different ways to do that. Which sets of choices win out has mostly had to do with how well they satisfy the compulsions of capital accumulation and the projects of empire and racial subordination through which those compulsions have historically been expressed. So together, these winning choices, as materialized in particular artifacts, form our technological inheritance. We're born into it. Marx famously observed that human beings don't make history under conditions of their own choosing, but rather under those transmitted from the past, that the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And this is especially true of our technology. The engineer or the designer is never working from a blank slate. They're always working within conditions transmitted from the past. And this introduces a problem for the third wave of algorithmic accountability, which is the problem that I think was expressed in the question that David quoted. How do you take a technological inheritance that has been engineered for empire, racial subordination, capital accumulation, and turn it against itself? How do you pursue a politics of liberation in a medium that is permeated with the politics of domination? If the technologies of all dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brain of the living, then how do we wake up from the nightmare? Is such a thing even possible? While you ponder that, I'm going to have some water. Okay, so that's at a certain level of abstraction. I think a concrete example, you may know what this is, may help bring this dilemma into sharper focus. So I suspect I don't have to explain Mastodon. We've been talking about it actually all day. But it's, for those who are not familiar, it's a network, a decentralized federated network of social media servers that run on open source software. And it's been around actually for a while, but has attracted more interest recently because of Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. Now, in many ways, Mastodon is the paradigmatic third wave project. Its creator, Eugen Rochko, has been very explicit about wanting to create a social media that is embedded with a very different set of values. And we could sketch those values as being, first, one of anti-commercialism. So Mastodon doesn't have advertising. There are no paid, promoted, targeted ads. Rochko's own software development work is crowdfunded. Most of the Mastodon instances are volunteer-run. Relatedly, there's no algorithmic feed that sequences content in a way that is designed to maximize user engagement for ad revenue. A second core value of Mastodon is what you might call devolved content moderation, which is that content moderation is performed at the server level. And in some cases, this has, which has been alluded to in previous conversations, this has enabled experiments in collective content moderation where users of the server are able to participate in a deliberative way to determine the rules that decide how content is moderated on their server. In any case, Rochko actually encourages servers to moderate content more rigorously than corporate social media platforms, because even though it is decentralized, there's a main Mastodon page to be listed on the kind of approved Mastodon instances. On this page, servers must commit to active moderation against racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. And particularly egregious servers can be isolated from the rest of the network. That happened, if you remember Gab, the fascist social networking site, created a Mastodon instance. Most of the other servers responded by blocking it. So you can kind of quarantine certain servers as well. Okay, so those all seem like efforts to encode a different political project, we could say, into Mastodon as a technical artifact. But if you've used Mastodon, or just looking at a screenshot of my Mastodon homepage, you also know that it looks and feels a lot like Twitter, right? I mean, it's almost a Twitter clone. You follow people and you see their tweets, which Mastodon calls toots. There are little icons of their profile pictures. You can reply to a toot. You can boost it, which is retweeting it. You can favorite it, which is liking it. There are DMs and threads. There are big accounts. There are little accounts. There are memes. There are reply guys. A lot of the culture, as well as the affordances of Twitter, are there. So Mastodon, in other words, has inherited the basic grammar of social media as configured by Twitter. And the question that we have to consider is to what extent this inheritance complicates, or perhaps even obstructs, the political program that has been quite consciously encoded into Mastodon as a technical artifact. Does it matter that Mastodon so closely resembles a platform whose guiding principles, which are the maximization of user engagement in order to monetize user attention and centralize and opaque content moderation practices, does it matter that it resembles a platform that is so antithetical to it in terms of those guiding architectural principles? And if so, how precisely does it matter? What are the specific effects that it has? I'm not going to try to answer these questions. I suspect that these are not questions that can be answered in the abstract, that they have to be answered concretely by trying things out and seeing what happens. I said before that critique is how we make the map of the terrain that the creativity of the third wave must traverse, but it turns out to be even more deliciously dialectical, which is that the map is made as the terrain is traversed. The critique and creativity have to advance together through experiment. Without an inkling of the contradictions that lay ahead, the third waver is doomed. But without moving ahead, the third waver never has the opportunity to experience those contradictions up close and thus learn what challenges they may pose for her project. So that all sounds pretty daunting. It's not really the sort of thing you say to someone when you're trying to get them to contribute to your open source software project. I wouldn't recommend it. But I don't think the situation is hopeless. In fact, I think there is a measure of hope to be found here. But to find it, to locate it and extract it for us, I think we will need to switch registers for a moment and shift from the social to the psychic, which is why you're seeing this trippy image up there. When we are talking about the contradictions of working within and against our technological inheritance, we're talking about the relationship between the past and the present. And this relationship, it turns out, is a central concern for psychoanalysis. An important psychoanalytic insight is that people have trouble with this relationship. They have trouble distinguishing past and present. There is no time in the unconscious, Freud said. The clocks have no hands, which is the memorable image of Ingmar Bergman's that we have up here. And this bears upon our behavior in all sorts of ways that I think we can recognize and relate to. We continuously reenact childhood traumas. As adults, we meet someone new and feel like we've known them our whole lives. The job of the analyst is to bring this confusion to consciousness, so as to help the patient identify a boundary between past and present. This is necessarily a porous boundary. A person remains a product of their history. But by positing a break, however incomplete, one becomes a little bit freer to move beyond one's history. Nothing more can happen in the past, right? It's past. The present affords a greater range of motion. You don't actually have to become a carbon copy of your parents. In fact, people rarely do. The past never completely encloses the present. There is always a discontinuity of some kind. The writer Alex Colston theorizes that this discontinuity is what makes revolutions possible. He writes, if this separation and independence did not exist between older and newer forms of society, or families and generations themselves, all social reproduction would produce mimetic and homogeneous replicas. This gap is conditio sine qua non for revolution and unthinkable without it. But breakthroughs, famously, whether of the psychic or the social sort, don't happen automatically. It takes work to turn discontinuity into disobedience. These concepts, I think, apply equally well to our technology. Our technological inheritance is also mediated by a degree of discontinuity. Here, too, the past does not completely enclose the present. On the one hand, as we've been discussing, the artifacts that populate our technological present carry a politics that has been molded by racial capitalism and its many imperial enterprises, yet they are not comprehensively determined by those politics. And this is because, as Winner writes, technology always does more than we intend. Technological systems are famously unpredictable. They tend to create a complex set of linkages that continue beyond one's original anticipation. Winner calls this process drift. Drift is the process whereby a technology imposes requirements of its own, pulling us along an unchosen course. So to return to the steam engine is a great example of drift. Steam engine demands an energy-dense and easily transportable fuel in the form of coal, and it thus initiates a hydrocarbon dependency that rewires eventually the entire economy of Britain and the world with, as we know, far-ranging ecological consequences. Now, this didn't obviate the steam engine's advantages to industrial capitalists in helping to secure a lower-cost labor pool, but it did impose a new and unforeseen set of obligations. Sometimes, however, those obligations can actually override a technology's politics. My favorite example of this is the invention of the first so-called high-level programming languages, such as COBOL in the 1950s. And one of the motivations for creating these languages was to produce a simpler way to write code, which would in turn enable managers to de-skill software development in order to reduce labor costs. But this actually backfires. It doesn't work, because when they took certain complexities away, it turns out they introduced new complexities. So what happens after the introduction of high-level programming languages is that demand for programmers actually grows. Drift is the entropy, the quantum of chaos that haunts the politics of technology. And at first, it may look like just another headache for the third wave of algorithmic accountability. The third waver must work first under the weight of a hostile technological inheritance, and now, even if she ever manages to inscribe an artifact with the politics of liberation, those politics may be muddled, even undermined by drift. Doing politics through technology is hard. It's like piloting a hot air balloon. You never know exactly where you're going to land. But I think there's a positive potential to highlight here as well. Drift also presents the third waver with an opportunity. Because to return to what I was talking about earlier, drift is the discontinuity within our technological inheritance. And as with our psychic and our social inheritances, discontinuity can serve as the basis for disobedience. We can step into the cracks and use them as points of subversion. The technological environment into which we have been born does not perfectly abide by the imperatives that formed it, and there is room, therefore, for redirection. And we see examples of this all the time. We're surrounded by them. Both the computer and the atom bomb were invented by capitalist countries to defeat global fascism, but a computer can be put to more purposes than warfare, can exceed the origin that it was developed for. Now, while the past does not completely enclose the present, it is equally true that we can never escape the past. History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake, says Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses. But history never ends, right? So there's the problem. Earlier, I asked this question: if the technologies of all dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brain of the living, then how do we wake up from the nightmare? Well, the answer is we can't. We can't wake up from the nightmare, but we can wake up inside the nightmare. Sorry. Waking up inside the nightmare is called dialectics. Adorno, who we're going to end with, believe it or not, tells us dialectics is the self-consciousness of the objective context of delusion. It does not mean to have escaped from that context. Its objective goal is to break out of the context from within. So for Adorno, crucially, this goal can never be achieved. There's no exit to that higher synthesis that Grace Lee Boggs spoke of. The positive moment of the dialectic never arrives. It's infinitely deferred. There's just the perpetual motion of dialectical cognition, restlessly picking away at the inadequacy of thought and thing, as Adorno puts it. So if you think of a firefly in a jar, it buzzes around trying to break out, never manages to, but in doing so illuminates the air around it. It lies in the definition of negative dialectics, Adorno writes, that will not come to rest in itself as if it were total. This is its form of hope. So you're probably thinking, what a pain in the ass, right? How could we end with Adorno? But pain is information. There's actually a medical condition that I've learned a lot about on YouTube called congenital insensitivity to pain, which you might be familiar with. It makes it impossible for someone to feel pain. And this is a very dangerous medical condition because you can injure yourself quite seriously without knowing it. So the suffering of the negative, as Grace Lee Boggs called it, the negative dialectics of waking up inside the nightmare and probing the gaps, probing the contradictions, is indispensable to the work of creating a better technological future. Because without it, I think we can do great injury to our politics. Not by failing, which is inevitable. I think failure is part of the experimental process through which a new technological politics will discover the practical forms that are adequate to it. I have in mind a different kind of failure, the sort that comes disguised as success. That's the scarier kind of failure. Because as we've seen throughout history, disobedience can resurrect what it overturns. The revolution can become the counter-revolution. So as the third wave of algorithmic accountability tries to build a new world in the shell of the old, I think all I'm asking is that we be mindful of the shell, that we keep faith with the traditions of critique that can help clarify the conditions under which our creativity must operate, that we cultivate some dialectical combination of humility and recklessness, and that we do our best to make something new in history without having any hope of ever escaping it. Thank you very much. Should we sit over there?
We have about 15 to 20 minutes to take questions, so
I can stand up. Yeah, I'll stay standing.
Okay.
Do you want me to, or are you going to call? You can do it.
Thanks, Ben. I mean, so I appreciate the emphasis on the emphasis on the ethic of experimentation.
Go back to the...
But I guess, and maybe this is also, I don't know, dialectic within a dialectic, but that has a material context, right? The ability for us to actually experiment isn't just a vibe. It has certain material preconditions. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that in the context of your book project. Like, what are the actual material preconditions it actually takes in order for us to actually, build out a culture and a context for constant technological experimentation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So imagination is expensive, right? And it's an embodied process. It's conducted by people who need to eat and who typically need significant resources in which to explore their creativity. Historically, we talked about R&D before. I mean, most of the R&D upon which the tech industry depends, of course, came out of public research, and in particular the Pentagon. So I think, in this country, we always struggle. I think this relates back to this question of technological inheritance. I think we always have to recognize and struggle with the fact that these technologies descended from the war-making apparatus of the state. In terms of what some positive models might be for not just a kind of funding a process of collective experimentation that didn't put militarism at the center, but also increased popular participation. At the end of my book, I talk about this experiment in London undertaken in the 1980s by the Greater London Council when it was under the control of the Labour Party left. And they created these spaces that today we would have think of probably as like hacker spaces or maker spaces. They called them somewhat confusingly technology networks. And these were places where anyone could walk in, get access to tools, get access to expertise, and develop small-scale technologies that were designed to address the concerns that they had and solve very practical problems for them. So one of the major areas of emphasis here were efficiency, energy efficiency technologies. And interestingly, these places became sites not just where people could come together to try to kind of unleash that collective creative process, but also became real sites of political organizing. Because in the process of trying to build technologies that solved their problems, people started to realize how many problems technology couldn't solve, and thus initiate organizing campaigns. So I think that's maybe a practical example that gives me some hope, because if there were a way to create some type of analogy to that today, where people could come in, get access to resources, get access to expertise, and start to build services, like many of the ones that Ethan mentioned, that address the problems of their lives and are accountable to them in a more collective way.
Thank you for, despite your disclaimers, what was really a very delightful talk. And I appreciate the grounding in Boggs as well. I think her also emphasis at the end of her life on like critical connections over critical mass is, it's been influenced my thinking on this stuff a lot. I just want to, around the question of drift or change, with two of the examples you used, I think there are some really instructive changes that have emerged through use that have shifted the politics embedded in the technology. And I'm curious if this could lead us toward a more general theory of like drift as opportunity. So for instance, with Mastodon, one thing that I'm trying to, I'd like to explore more this summer with a project we're doing at my lab, but that, it is actually the differences with Twitter. It's not a perfect clone. And one of the important inputs was that there was important participation among people who have transgender experience in the development of the ActivityPub protocol, and then in turn shaping the development of Mastodon. So for instance, you have a very different way of confirming identity on Mastodon that's self-affirming rather than requiring a third-party, affirmation. And then also search restrictions. It might be annoying to many of us on Mastodon that you can't just search any term. You can only search hashtags. That was actually used that was an intentional defense mechanism against harassment of trans communities coming out of that experience. And so, it's one way in which the politics gets embedded. And then also with crypto, I think you're absolutely right that there is a deep politics embedded in that technology in Bitcoin, but you also see evolution in the politics embedded in systems like Ethereum and Cosmos and some of the successor protocols that have emerged from it that have also actually both embedded and generated very different ideologies. So you wouldn't hear like an Ethereum developer talking in quite that way. Mm-hmm. They would have they would talk about like coordination and other buzzwords, that are adjacent but also distinct. And so with these two cases, I wonder like if we have to think about drift as entropy, right? Or whether we can see it as opportunity to insert different kinds of experience into the ongoing evolution of the technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we could think about it both ways. I think entropy can be an opportunity, but I think you raise an interesting point, which is we have to develop some way of identifying which technologies are more malleable than others. And there are technologies whose politics can be transformed through use. Whose politics can be revised, let's say, in ways that others can't. Is there constructive use that the atom bomb could be put, right? I mean, when Mao's China got it, it was the people's bomb. But I mean, this kind of really pushes the boundaries, right? That certain technologies shouldn't exist. And this is, again, I think why we need all three waves, because the abolitionist perspective, I think, needs to always complement us as we look for alternatives. But I think that's a good question. And I think, your point about Mastodon versus Twitter, part of the difficulty here is that we're locked in these centuries of path dependency. So I don't mean to suggest that we're going to burst out of that in one leap. I think it's precisely that Mastodon has a somewhat familiar interface that makes it a viable project, right? If it just looked completely different, it completely reconfigured how people connected online, it would be much more difficult for people to take that step. So it's inevitably an iterative process of how we get from here to there. And sometimes that process moves more quickly and sometimes it moves more slowly. But I think inevitably it's a series of iterations. But you had your hand up.
I was going to jump on Sanjay's earlier question and ask you to speak a little bit more about these technology networks, one of my favorite key studies in your book. And just thinking a bit more concretely about how can we actualize something like that today, say, in the U.S. And mean, I know you have given it some thought. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very feasible to imagine these operating with a degree of public funding, I think at the municipal or the state level. Again, I think and I think we've all been talking about this today, but it's really making the case for the costs of the existing models, right? And your work, is a lot about this, where people trying to make people understand that there are very serious costs to not having reliable information in your community. Like there are very serious costs that we're paying by ceding our networked lives to a handful of large corporations that are creating a profit-driven internet, right? And I think once we persuade people of the existence of these costs, I think it makes it easier to make the case for investment, right? Because I think for a long time, it was hard to have these conversations. Like why would a municipality fund something kind of like a hackerspace where people come together to build very, very small online platforms? I think we're actually in a much better place now to make that case because of the tech backlash. I think I could knock on doors now and make the case that which I couldn't 5 years ago, because there's so much more recognition, which is politicized in all sorts of ways and in some regressive ways as well. But there's much more recognition of the deficiencies of these spaces for certain kinds of conversations. So I think there's optimism there, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine knocking on someone's door in 2015 and having that conversation lead somewhere productive. But I think we could do it today. The common sense has shifted on that.
If I could, just to weigh on this, we did actually do this. So we had the Technology Opportunities Program in the 1990s. We invested in community technology centers all across the country. Larry Irving, I think it's still at NDA, who was overseeing this program. And for several years, we funded it. And then we stopped, like a cliff, we just stopped. Most of them then go belly up all across the country. And then a few years later, what do? We're like, oh, you know what? Instead of the top program, now we're going to do the Broadband Technologies Opportunities Program, VTOP. We're going to invest in all these projects all across the country. We're going to fund them for about half a decade, and then we're just going to cut all the public funding. I almost feel like there's almost this lost history that we should be dependent to, but because everyone's forgotten it, it's almost like we won't learn then from what worked successfully in the United States for multiple years until we cut off the funding for that. And so, yes, I would absolutely encourage you to explore this and resurface this history. And, now we're at 3.0 of these programs where it's like, oh, so what's going to happen this time with the 65 billion? Call me crazy, but we're going to fund a bunch of stuff for a few years, and then we're just going to, and then we're like, why didn't that work? And maybe there's an opportunity for intervention there. Smart thinkers such as yourself could then say like, hey, here's the last quarter century since the advent of wider spread internet access, it does work until we strangle it, which we've done now twice previously.
And the technology networks that we're talking about in London suffered the same fate. So
Exactly.
Thatcher
Yeah.
abolishes the GLC, the funding dries up, and a few of them hang on, but in order to hang on, they have to shift into this much more entrepreneurial register, where it becomes about business education, kind of business-driven innovation. But most of them close, very soon after. So, I think that highlights one of the challenges and contradictions of using public policy as a tool, is that public policy can create space for some of these alternatives to emerge. But if they don't become responsible for their own reproduction, it's a very fragile relationship. See Ethan's hand.
So, Ben, I think in some ways this is supposed to be a hopeful talk because there's this third path that creates this very helpful landscape between critique and creativity. And as someone who's very much seeking to inhabit that landscape, I deeply appreciate that. But I have to say, drift is now scaring the crap out of me. And here's what I mean about that. When we look at drift with the steam engine, it ends up taking a fairly predictable path, which is the drift is around energy, right? Energy is scarce. First, it forces us out into the comparative wilderness where we have all sorts of labor problems. So now we drift to a place where we're in urban settings, but now we have coal. So the UK is in really good shape, but lots of other places are not. And then we move on to oil, and you can write a good history of industrialization based on how energy regulates that drift. My guess is in the space of social media, the critical commodity is attention, right? We've created this ability for people to demand enormous amounts of attention. We don't actually make any more human attention. And so we have this fierce competition over it. It's where advertising comes in. It's probably the problem that we haven't figured out how to solve. And even if we think about how we create these alternative systems, we're still going to be fighting attention. And my prediction is that's where the drift goes. Around AI, we have yet another piece of this, which is if we're extrapolating from enormous amounts of societal data, we are encoding the inequities and biases of all of that action. And that seems incredibly hard to avoid in all of this. So I'm wondering whether a take from this is we can predict where those drifts are going. And those drifts actually seem very, very hard to avoid. They seem almost like a current that we're going to very carefully have to tack against if we want to move in any directions on this. Am I less hopeful than I should be, or am I finding an aspect of this theory that worries me as much as it should be worrying me?
I think I'm more worried now hearing you talk, actually.
I do that to people. Sorry.
I think, so drift affects our projects, but it also affects the projects that we're trying to contest. So I think, again, there is a danger but an opportunity, right? I think it is scary because I think doing politics through technology exposes us to a set of unforeseen possibilities. And I don't think it needs to be quite even at the scale of hydrocarbon dependency. I think, look, I work in the tech industry. I'm sure many of you are familiar with various tech for good initiatives where I think well-intentioned people who want to make a contribution socially will get involved with some type of community initiative. It could just be, creating some program that helps data get into a different set of spreadsheets. But often in the course of these projects, kind of the technology begins to impose requirements of its own that are not only orthogonal, but are sometimes kind of antithetical to the context in which they're embedded, right? So that person who thought they were coming in as a kind of technical servant of the project ends up, if not destroying it, kind of impeding it, because of they're bringing. So I think we can see that level of drift even in a smaller form. I like the way you put it of a current that you have to tack against, because I think drift affects our projects, and it's something that I think it is actually difficult to predict what consequences will develop. So it compels us to have a degree of humility, I think, And again, to bring these traditions of critique with us along the way as we continue to iterate on these alternatives. But I think, again, it is an opportunity, because it means that this technological inheritance that we are born into and that we have to work within also has these cracks that we can use.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Behind you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, just real quick. We don't have to look. Hi, my name's Simon Galperin. I run the community info co-op in New Jersey, so I'm going to rep the state. You don't have to look that far back to see people getting engaged in building new information ecosystems. In the state in 2015, I was knocking on doors, getting people involved in listening sessions for the Civic Information Consortium, which is a state body that now funds local news and technology projects like mine in the Newark area. So I think that there is, so I just wanted to mention that there are things like that that might not be technology or broadband that people are getting involved in that I just wanted to amplify.
Thank you. Should we do one more? You're the timekeeper. You tell me.
Last question.
Last question. Well, can we do like a combo?
Yeah, mine's a really
Can we
short.
meld two questions?
Yeah.
Let's do
Okay.
it. All right.
Meld into. So, I mean, I'm just picking up right where your comment was, which is the thing that kept standing out to me, Ben, when I was listening. It was really, really interesting to talk, is what can generate that capacity to act and that capacity to feel like you have voice and the opportunity to decenter governance, right? And I guess it's exactly initiatives like what you're describing that sort of answer my question, because, you know, from my own fieldwork, I see, you know, younger Gen Z kind of born into a world where, you know, life expectancy is dropping in this country and standard of living is decreasing, even if you account for inflation. Troubling, right? And then I work with global populations that feel very far removed from all these apparatuses of global tech, right? So I guess it's like, it's kind of what we've all been saying today. I was just thinking it through as you were describing it. It's sort of creating spaces and opportunities for enacting and acting and building something catalytic from there. But that's just me thinking out loud. If you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you. You wanna?
So, I was curious of your thoughts on sort of this problem of drift and the velocity and impacts of it. And in particular, I think about when it first started, almost quarter century, getting people online. It was very simple. It's like, getting online is probably going to be good for you. Now I'm like, right. So then it was like, okay, now it's going to be like, we're going to, as Ethan was pointed out, we're going to grab your attention when you're online. I'm like, okay, we're going to teach digital literacy. Now it's like online plus digital literacy. Now I'm like, okay, I'm teaching them digital literacy, but now they're using applications that are surveilling them. I'm like, fuck, now I got to teach you cybersecurity. And it's like, I almost feel like the lift is getting heavier and heavier and heavier over time, because those first path dependencies are getting like more and more evil. And so now I don't just need X amount of money like I did in top days, or X plus 10 money like I needed in B top days. I need like exponentially more funds because things have gotten so much worse. So that happened. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, we should get as depressing as possible before we start drinking. I really liked what Christopher Elise said today about how connectivity is more than just wires in the ground. You know, and I thought about that a lot while writing the book. Of organizations that are not just trying to increase connectivity, but changing how we connect and creating interpersonal relationships around the infrastructure. You know, it's not, I'm trying to find a more hopeful tone here, because you brought us down a bit. But I like that as a starting point. And I think it kind of connects to the question or the comment that Ramesh contributed, which is what can generate the capacity to act, right? So, and you know, many of you have done organizing work. Organizing is relationships. It's mostly, if you want to organize your workplace, you mostly just have conversations with your coworkers over and over and over again until you all trust each other enough to do something which is risky and scary and could result in the loss of your livelihood. And it's often boring and even difficult, but those types of relationships are what has historically sustained any kind of political change, any project of social transformation, however small, however big. at this point, I think, given all the crises we face, it's fair to say that technology, or let's say the internet, will probably not be the top organizing issue for anyone in particular. Right? There's so many other things that are going to be at the top of the list. And the way I've tried to think about it is not to position the internet, or if we want to say technology, as something that is kind of competing for the very scarce mind share and resources of organizers, wherever they may be, but as something which is an integral component of all of the issues that they're organizing around. So if you care about climate justice, if you care about racial justice, the technology is always going to be there. It cares about you, even if you don't care about it. So I think the role that we can play as people who care about technology and care about politics is to play a constructive role in injecting the kind of technology component of these other organizing issues. And then because technology and frankly the internet is the connective tissue for all of these issues, it can also be a way to bring all these organizations together, which is I think a kind of hopeful possibility that it can actually be the basis for that coalition building, for that broader project of articulation. Because ultimately, that's what we need, is like, how do you build the collective actor of social transformation after all the failures of the 20th century? So with that, let's drink. Thank you so much, appreciate it.